So, nevertheless, here we are in Deuteronomy chapter 4, essentially at the end of the chapter. We are in an interlude passage between the end of this first speech given by Moses here, which ended in the last passage that we covered in Deuteronomy, the end of verse 40 here. And the conclusion thereof sets the stage then for the transition which occurs herein at the end of the chapter between the first and second speeches. The second speech itself technically begins in verse 44 of this fourth chapter, and so we'll then move through verses 44 to the end in verse 49, and then the beginning of chapter 5 in the next lesson. But here in this literary interlude of verses 41 through 43 provide an important contextual reference for the concept of justice that Moses is about to deliver unto the Israelites in this second speech, wherein he begins, when you turn through to chapter 5, with the recommissioning or the re-giving, the retelling of the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. And here there is the details therein contained are that which we had referenced earlier in the liturgy in the Old Testament reading in Numbers chapter 35, which we'll also cross-reference here as well. And it may be familiar to some of you, it may not be familiar to others, which is fine. But what we'll see here this morning as we connect these particular Old Testament passages, namely this one here in Deuteronomy 4, as well as its cross-reference back in Numbers 35, with texts from Genesis chapter 9, as well as two particular texts from the New Testament as well, from the Pauline epistles. What we'll see here is actually a rather deep, profound and impactful exposition on the concept of justice, on the value of life, and on God as the source and origin of all life itself. What we have here, beginning in verse 41, is Moses establishing, in this particular contextual reference, three what we call cities of refuge. Cities of refuge. And it's related conceptually to another term or another concept, a jurisprudential one, that is to say a legal one, of the Goel Chadam, which we'll explain as we go through, the blood avenger. So let's begin in verse 41 of Deuteronomy chapter 4. Then Moses set apart 3 cities across the Jordan to the east toward the sunrise, that a manslayer might flee there, who slew his neighbor without premeditation, not hating him previously. So he shall flee to one of these cities that he might live. And then in verse 43 we have the outlining of those 3 particular cities in what we call the east bank of the Jordan, in opposition to the west bank of the Jordan, which gets referenced elsewhere in Numbers and other such texts as well, particularly in Exodus also. And those in this specific reference of chapter 4 in verse 33 is the city of Bezer in the wilderness, which is on the plateau given to the Reubenites, Ramoth in Gilead of the Gadites, and then finally Golan in Bashan for the Manassites, what we refer historically to as the Golan Heights. These 3 cities exist in what is also historically called Transjordan, or across the Jordan, to the east of the Jordan, and then 3 other cities were given on the western side of the Jordan in the land of Canaan. And for the broader historical context, this comes to us from Numbers 35. It might be useful if you would turn there with me to Numbers 35 so that we can read the passage that we had from earlier in the liturgy, specifically verses 16 to 21. Earlier, through, I think going as far back as about verse 9 off memory, he is outlining, as in this case here Moses, the author of Numbers, is outlining where these cities are to be taken from, or where they are to be allocated from, I should really say, namely that they are Levitical cities. So they are of the Levitical priesthood. We have a totem number of 48 that are given elsewhere, but of these particular 6, do we have this allocation of cities of asylum or cities of refuge, in which this legal or jurisprudential concept would play out in society. And in verse 16 of Numbers chapter 35 we read, "But if he," referring to the manslayer, the killer, but if he struck him down with an iron object so that he died, that is to say his victim, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he struck him down with a stone in hand, by which he would die, and as a result he did die, then he is a murderer, and the murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he struck him with a wooden object in the hand, by which he would die, and as a result did, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall surely be put to death. Herein Moses is using common parallelisms that are endemic to Hebrew literature. He's also connecting them and in a way, through parallelism, using what we call a hyperbolic literary device. In other words, simply he's expounding upon the initial point by repeating it multiple times. The one who strikes with an iron object, the one who strikes with a stone, the one who strikes with a wooden object. Here he is thoroughly and conclusively and exhaustively expounding upon the one who kills with intent, the one who strikes him down. He is a murderer. And so in verse 19 he then says that the Goel Chadam, for those who like to take notes, it's transliterated into English as G-O'-E-L, Goel. Second word Chadam, H-A-D-D-A-M. Goel meaning avenger or redeemer, which is a concept we'll touch on by the time we get to the end, and Chadam meaning blood, so the avenger of blood or the blood avenger. In verse 19, the Goel Chadam, the blood avenger himself, shall put the murderer to death. He shall put him to death when he meets him. Now, before we get back to the specifics of verse 19, I want to continue in verses 20 to 21 and show you how that parallels with verses 16 through 18. So verse 20, and if he pushed him out of hatred or threw something at him lying in wait, and as a result he died, or if he struck him down with his hand in enmity, that is to say as an enemy, and as a result he died, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death, for he is a murderer. The blood avenger shall surely put the murderer to death when he meets him. Now, before we get on to the nature and the purpose of the Goel Chadam, the blood avenger, I want you to see two important things playing out that not just doctrinally but philosophically impact and, in no uncertain terms, define our understanding of justice. What you have in verses 16 through 18, here in Numbers 35, is what we find to be the fundamental basis of what we call in jurisprudential terms actus reus, or guilty act. This is then joined literally and theologically and philosophically with verses 20 and 21, which is the outlining of what we call, again in jurisprudential terms, mens rea, or guilty mind. Those two legal concepts, actus reus and mens rea, serve as the pillars of demonstrating criminal intent and criminal action. In order to prosecute a crime in any common law system, hailing down throughout the history of Britain, and this also plays itself out in the civil law system of European continental ancestry, you have to demonstrate that the perpetrator has committed a guilty act, actus reus, and did so with, to one degree or another, depending on the actual jurisprudence of that jurisdiction, malice aforethought. That is to say, a guilty mind. They knew they were committing a crime and they did it anyway. There are exceptions to this, rare but exceptional circumstances in which someone is classified as criminally insane or criminally unfit to stand trial, and this as an act of mercy against those who are suffering from mental illness or who are able to be declared criminally insane. But as a fundamental basis of law and of righteousness and of justice in the history of Western civilization, these two pillars of jurisprudence find their source, their wellspring, in this passage that you're reading, in Numbers chapter 35, verses 16 through 21. This here is the very basis. And how is this the case? 16 through 18 is describing the action, the striking down with an iron object, so sword and axe and shield and such. Striking down in verse 17 with a stone, vis-a-vis, of course, the famous, or perhaps I should say infamous, killing of Abel by his brother Cain. And the striking down with wooden object. Here this is simply Moses expounding upon the guilty act itself, but that it is coupled with verses, as we see, 20 and 21, the guilty mind. In verse 20, pushing him out of hatred, throwing something at him while he lies in wait, so ambushing, right? A demonstration of his premeditation, the fact that he has a forethought, or he has thought this through before the action. Striking him down with his hand in verse 21 in enmity, right? So malice, the bitterness, the hatred. This one who has the guilty mind and does the guilty act as a consequence, he is a murderer. And the murderer is to be put to death. In this particular text, as well as that is paraphrased and referenced in Deuteronomy chapter 4, in this contextual example explained that the blood avenger was the rightful legal authority by which this would occur. So it gets to the question of who or what is the blood avenger. The blood avenger in ancient cultures, including ancient Israelite culture, was a identifiable, dedicated man of a family, or usually often a clan, so extended family, who was known to be the blood avenger of that clan, who was known and established as a role in the life of his clan, the life of his tribe, the life of his kingdom, so on and so forth. And of course, for each clan you would have a blood avenger. You would have one who would bring justice against someone who had murdered a member of their family or of their clan. Now today in modern Western civilization, with our comparatively highly developed institutions and history, civilly and culturally and legally and the likewise, this concept may seem foreign, and in fact often does. But we do have to see in perspective of history that throughout most of human history, there has never been such a thing as a full-time professional law enforcement bureau or agency or department. Most jurisdictions at whatever particular level, be they tribal, be they kingdoms, be they empires, be they any of the such, have not had full-time professional, that is to say, standing armies. So an army, a navy, these days an air force, these kinds of organisations are a largely modern phenomenon, not exclusively. Of course, there's been many famous professional armies, the Romans being the height of those in the ancient world. But Rome and its army were an exception to the rule. They were an exception. Even through much of the medieval period, the vast preponderance of Europe had no standing armies. If you had to go to war, the farmers would be putting down their ploughshares and picking up their swords. Okay. The common man, the peasant, was the one who would then be raised by his lord or his vassal, led by knights attached to those vassals or to those lords, I should say. And they would then go to war. They would then defend the kingdom. They would then enact justice, so on and so forth. And it's not until really the 16th century, 15th I should say, the late 1400s, that the first standing army in European history after the Romans actually comes about with the imperial army of the Holy Roman Empire. Why am I bothering to point this out to you? I'm trying to bridge the gap in our understanding of justice and its authority. The blood avenger was not just a random guy. He was not just a group. There was no such thing as blood avengers, plural, at least not per family or per clan. There was one. He was known. If someone within your clan was murdered, if their blood was unjustly spilled upon the earth, no time was wasted in figuring out what should be done. The owners looking around for someone to step into the proverbial fray. It was now time for the blood avenger to perform his duty unto his clan and really unto society as a whole, to not allow the murderer to just simply escape free of justice, to allow someone who would kill with malice aforethought to keep wandering around society, potentially to kill someone else again. And so this blood avenger was to fulfill his really sacred duty, his obligation to his family, his obligation to society, and his obligation to the justice of God, by tracking down the murderer and by putting him to death. Now, before we get into some of the more relevant theological premises, although that of course is relevant, it's important that we understand why this is the case. Why is this taken so seriously, not only in Numbers 35, but also then by virtue of it being mentioned again in paraphrase in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Genesis chapter 9 is where we get the second really detailed exposition on the value of life in specific terms. And perhaps it's useful if you would turn there with me to Genesis chapter 9. Here in Genesis chapter 9, following the great flood of the ancient world, God speaks unto Noah, and in the first 5 verses he recommissions the same, what we call dominion mandate given to Adam, namely to be fruitful and multiply, and then to go forth into the world and to take dominion, to order chaos just as God himself had ordered chaos. And then in verses 6 and 7, we get this exposition, this command of the value of human life and the consequence for the illicit and unjust taking of it. In Genesis chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, herein God says unto Noah, "Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he made man. As for you, be fruitful and multiply, increase upon the earth and multiply in it. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." And again, when you read the fuller, broader context, it's not specifically talking about any shedding of blood at all whatsoever. It's talking specifically about what we'd refer to as murder in English. This herein is a vital text for our understanding of all that we've seen thus far in Deuteronomy 4 and Numbers 35. The value of human life, which literally and figuratively is represented in the blood, speaks to the heart of not just what man is, namely made in the image of God, as herein expounded by God in verse 6, but more centrally and more metaphysically, it speaks to the value of God as the source of life itself. The destruction, the obliteration, the annihilation of human life unjustly and illicitly is to destroy and to annihilate the image of God upon the earth. It is at its heart to strike at the very ontological reality of who God is as the one who spoke life into existence, the one who is the very source and origin of all life, in whom and by whom and for whom all things were created, and in whom and by whom and for whom all things are perpetually maintained. He not only is the giver of life and the author thereof, he is the one who consistently and constantly, even at this very moment, continues to sustain the animation of all the living. He did not merely set the world into motion, but rather is intimately and intricately intertwined in its ongoing life and sustenance. To destroy the image of God is a direct affront and assault and offence against that source of the image itself. And so the scriptures are explicitly clear on what the punishment, the justice, the just and righteous action and consequence for murder, for homicide, is. And that is what we would call capital punishment. That is to say, the death penalty. It is not because God is capricious. It is not because he is barbaric. It is because he is just. It is because he is righteous. It is because that is not only how valuable human life is, but that is how valuable the giver of human life is. You can search every single last corner and crevice, from the very beginning to the very end of sacred scripture, and you will find nothing else than but one stated view. The punishment for murder is death. Now, we in modern Western civilization, particularly the last 100 years, have deluded ourselves into thinking that we are somehow more compassionate than God, that we are somehow more benevolent than the Almighty, that we are somehow more gracious and more merciful than He who is the very standard of justice in the world. Many Western jurisdictions, including our own, have eliminated the right punishment of murder, namely the death penalty, and instead have substituted it for a long and fruitful life, surrounded by often friends, with televisions and PlayStations and vacation trips and all manner of full meals every day, while the victim of such murder lies rotting in the ground and their families continue to suffer here in this life. Because we have deluded ourselves into thinking that we are more compassionate than God, that we're nicer than Him. And this is no trivial point. One of the most unjust things that occurs in our society is the lack of capital punishment. Why is that the case? Because you cannot, I repeat, cannot separate jurisprudence, that is to say the theory or philosophy of law, what the laws should be and what the punishment for breaking said laws should be. You cannot separate jurisprudence from your fundamental worldview, your fundamental belief about what the world is, about what human beings are, about our place in the world, in the cosmos, in life. You cannot separate it from theology. You cannot separate it from philosophy. You cannot separate it from metaphysics. All of these fields are intertwined. That is why, even still, as fading and failing as one might, I would argue, successfully posit, our current judicial institutions have become, you still find within them an almost endless list of jurisprudential bases coming throughout the history and the lineage of the common law system hailing from medieval Britain, which was drawn from one ultimate source: this, the Bible. Because you cannot separate law from God. When you do, you will only have injustice. You will only have unrighteousness. Because to separate yourself from the standard of justice while thinking that you can somehow still have justice is as foolish as thinking that you can separate yourself from the source of all goodness, truth, and beauty while somehow ever finding genuine goodness, truth, and beauty in this world. To separate yourself from the source of life, namely God, is but a path toward death, to destruction, to chaos, not order and goodness and life. These are serious and weighty matters. And so the murderer could not just simply run free. The murderer could not just be simply given 5 to 10 or 20 years in prison. He could not just be simply held under house arrest or any other such aberration of justice. There was one just penalty, for there is one just penalty for the unlawful, illegal, hatred and hateful murder of another human being, and that is death. This speaks to another common misconception that we have. This ancient legal basis or position known in Latin to us in the West as lex talionis, or an eye for an eye. That again comes from the scriptures. It's not solely found in the scriptures. It was known throughout the ancient world. It features in other such law codes like a code of Hammurabi, an ancient Babylonian legal code. But an eye for an eye in the modern day is often thought as blind retribution, pardon the pun, as simply getting even, when in fact that was never how it was understood, nor has it ever been understood that way historically, because an eye for an eye is actually a statement of genuine justice. If someone takes an eye, you do not cut their head off. If someone takes an eye, you do not take their leg, nor their hand, nor any other such part in this particular analogy. An eye for an eye, equal and balanced and level justice. The 16-year-old who robs a pharmacy store or a convenience store on the corner, commits theft, be it statutory or otherwise, should not be put to death. But the one who murders, who slays with both a guilty mind, that is to say malice aforethought, vis-a-vis Numbers 35, 20 and 21, and does the guilty action itself knowingly, Numbers 35 verses 16 through 18, he should be put to death as a demonstration of the justice of God, that life is precious, that life is valuable, that we as human beings get but one mortal life. Now, we as Christians have hope beyond this, and we'll cover this as we get towards the end of the sermon. But we have but one mortal life. To snatch that from somebody has metaphysical consequences far beyond what most people are actually willing or even capable of conceptualizing. You are, by definition, ending any hope of their mortal life to the future. If they are without child, you are quite literally severing a bloodline that traces its way all the way back to the origin of man. That bloodline, within which, by the time you work its way through, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, indeed billions upon billions coming before them have lived, have survived under all manner of dire circumstances, whose ancestors have escaped death more than once, who have lived, who have struggled, who have provided, who have got by the proverbial skin of their teeth, in order to ensure that hopefully one or two of their 6, 8, 10 children actually manage to survive to adulthood, as is the common story of man throughout history. And not thousands of years ago, very recently, that was normal. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was Jonathan Edwards, the renowned 18th century American Presbyterian theologian, president of Princeton University, prolific, intelligent, brilliant mind, famous throughout the modern Reformed history of the church. I believe it was him, off memory, who had 11 children in total, and only one of them survived to adulthood. That is common. And that's before one even highlights how many women have died during childbirth, which is far more common throughout history than we now, by the grace of God, are accustomed to. All of that history, all of that providence of God, severed by the hand of one who in hatred, malice, envy, bitterness, anger, lust, decides to end that life. That's the gravity of murder. And so the only just punishment is the death of him who commits such an incalculable and egregious offence against the very concept of life itself. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And so this is why the blood avenger was in that position. But recognizing, of course, that the blood avenger is also a mortal man, is also human, is also tied to his own sins, to his own passions, to his own vices, especially under such circumstances in which someone, often extremely close to him, a dear loved one, has now been slain or murdered. In such circumstances, despite his obligations, despite his duty to uphold justice objectively, he is mortal, and so being swayed by bloodlust, as we would call it, was something that needed to be balanced against. And so the reason why we then have what we've got as our primary text here in Deuteronomy 4, these, in this case, this specific text 3 on the eastern side, elsewhere also then added to the 3 on the far side or the western side of the Jordan. These 3 cities of refuge is as a balance, a check and balance, against the potential bloodlust of the blood avenger. The one who was not guilty of murder, but who was guilty of what today we would call legally manslaughter, sometimes in other jurisdictions involuntary homicide, would flee to one of these cities of refuge, not purely to escape justice, but rather to escape the immediate retribution and justice of the blood avenger. If he then entered into one of these cities of refuge, east of the Jordan, we have there reference what those are in verse 43, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golan in Bashan. He would then be, as places in Exodus describe, as Numbers 35 also goes on to, I believe, as well, he would then make known to the city officials, particularly to the priests there in the city, the religious officials, what had happened, that he had accidentally killed another person. It could have been through all manner of things. It could have been working on a building and something collapses. It could have been walking through a particularly dangerous area and something happens, he trips and falls. All manner of kind of instances, random as they may seem, in which someone accidentally kills someone, because again, the lack of malice aforethought, what is in Numbers 35 described there in verses 20 and 21, is the delineation between whether someone is guilty of murder or manslaughter, as we would today call it, right? So the intent, the malice aforethought, it's still serious. It still is not to just have nothing done about it per se, but it changes the nature of it. And so he would need to flee to one of these cities of refuge. After having, as I mentioned, informed the authorities in the city, particularly the religious ones, he would then be under protected guard taken to, later on in history, Jerusalem. But long story short, taken usually to the place or the town, the village or the city in which the manslaughter had occurred, in which the death had occurred. He would then stand trial there, and if of course found guilty of murder, he would then rightfully of course be put to death. But if it was in fact manslaughter, if it was in fact a tragic accident, He did not just simply get to now go freely about his life as if nothing happened, but he would then be taken again by armed guard back to the city of refuge, in which he would essentially live in the confine of the city. A kind of, in one sense you could think, house arrest. He didn't have the freedom to just go about wherever he wanted to. He didn't have the freedom to do this and do that and just live a nice, happy life anymore. But he would not be put to death because, again, there was the lack of malice aforethought. He didn't mean to kill the man. But he has still shed blood. He has still done something, in negligence or otherwise, that's brought about the death of someone, of another man, of another woman. And so he or she would remain under a kind of arrest in that city. There is also described wherein, later on, this occurs again in the other major text in which this is outlined, that the amount of time he would have to remain, he or she would have to remain in that city of refuge, was until the high priest had passed away. When that high priest, whichever was installed at that particular time, passed away, he would then have the end of that confine. Okay? And that, for those who are interested, serves as the basis of what we call statute of limitations in legal terms. Again, you can try all you want, you will be hard-pressed to find a particular legal concept in the history of Western law, be it common or civil, that does not trace its origins back to the Bible. But the blood avenger served as an important enactor, or in this case literally avenger, of justice. He was the righter of wrongs. He was God's minister of wrath and of justice against evil, but with check and with balance, with a level of objectivity that protected the one who hadn't done it with malice aforethought. He didn't simply get off scot-free, but he was not to be put to death, because the murderer, the one who kills with malice aforethought, with hatred and bitterness in his heart, he is a murderer, and he shall, as Numbers 35 says, surely be put to death. This standard of justice is the only standard of justice. And what makes it particularly egregious in our own day is that we, in Australia and in other Western jurisdictions, have eliminated capital punishment for murder, and at the exact same time have a vibrant, profitable, widespread, acknowledged, celebrated industry of putting children to death in, through and by the abortion industry, in which not merely do all those involved, be it the doctor, the facilities, be it the mother, be it the father, not only do they escape justice, but indeed their acts are celebrated, are promoted, and are funded by every single one of you in here who pays taxes. That is the level of absolute moral insanity into which we have descended. Death is not merely allowed to escape free or be swept under the rug, as we might say. Death is celebrated. You now live in a culture of death. Sodom and Gomorrah will stand in judgment of this nation. Sodom and Gomorrah will stand in judgment of the United States of America. Sodom and Gomorrah will stand in judgment of Canada, of New Zealand, of the United Kingdom, and of modern Western civilization as we know it. We have absolutely in totem inverted the very standard of justice. These actions that we undertake and partake in and of and celebrate and promote and fund would make our ancestors sick. We would be cast off by them, we would be disowned by them, and rightfully so. We engage in a level of philosophical and pragmatic barbarity that I dare say would make even certain medieval pagan civilizations and cultures uneasy. Why is this the case, and how did we get here? We got here, again, through our ideas. I've explained this many times before. Every action is precipitated by thought, even ones that are done rashly, even ones that are done wantonly, even ones that are done spur as the moment, as we might say, are done with a lack of thought driven by emotions. There is always something operating within the mind that precipitates every single action, including our lack of logical thought and our abdication unto our own emotions. The actions that we see play out before us were precipitated in exactly the same fashion by thoughts, by ideas, by ideologies, by new ways of thinking. The devaluation of the human life, the devaluation of the source of human life. This is the pathway and the trajectory. As a consequence of the stepping aside, of the pushing out, of the removal of God from not only our civic life and our institutions, but first and foremost from our individual and familial lives in the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries particularly. We see ourselves cut off gradually and progressively from God and from all the goodness, the beauty, the truth, the righteousness, the justice that comes solely and squarely from Him alone. And then we stand in wonder and in utter bafflement and confusion as to why on earth the world descends into the two most bloody and horrifying and egregious wars that the world has ever seen, and why we somehow found ourselves in the midst of the deadliest century in the history of the world, namely the 20th, wherein more people died in combat or as a result of combat than in every other century combined. Because actions have consequences. Because as I've spoken of before here, the culture of a people is downstream from its worship. And the politics comes right at the end beyond the culture. It is because we abandoned God. It is because the Russian people, for example, and particularly and specifically those who had been captured and ensnared themselves unto the godless ideology of Marxism, we then find them descend into a horrifically bloody revolution and a state of, quite literally, hell on earth for the next 70 years under the USSR, in which God was illegal, in which the state was your new God, in which atheism and secular humanism was the state religion. Consequences to actions, because actions have consequences. And we ourselves are now neck deep in this very same quagmire. And so then what then be the solution? What then be the restitution? How then are we to see this and to understand this and to work towards the restitution thereof? In Deuteronomy 32, later on in the book in which we are studying and learning from, in chapter 32, in verses 35 and 43, God speaking, he says, "Vengeance is mine and retribution. In due time, their foot," that is to say, the enemies of God, "their foot will stumble. For the day of their disaster is near, and their doom comes swiftly." Verse 43, "Rejoice in him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods. For God will avenge the blood of his servants, and he will render vengeance upon his enemies, and he will atone for his land and for his people." He will avenge the blood of his servants. How so? By rendering vengeance upon his enemies, thereby atoning for his land and for his people. This is the hope that all of God's people, that all Christians have had throughout the ages, from before the time in which these words are uttered, all the way down to our own day. This is the promise of the sovereign God of righteousness, who is called Yahweh Tsabaoth, Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, the God of war. The one who is consistently envisioned with sword and shield in hand. The one who rides forth upon horse-drawn chariot to war. Not out of bloodlust, not out of a desire for barbarity and for ruthless conquest, but instead for the adjudication and the execution of justice in the world, for the maintenance of righteousness in the land, for the avenging of the blood spilt of those who are innocent by the hands of those who are not, for the conquest of order over chaos, for the victory of light over darkness. This is who God is. The mightiest of warriors, who fights for and defends and protects his people in and through and by all things. This is so powerfully picked up, particularly in the Revelation of John. In the blood of those slain lying beneath the altar. Of course, he's writing this in a time when many have been slaughtered throughout the Neronic persecution under the tyrant, the Emperor Nero of Rome, and their blood crying out for justice. And God indeed brought that justice and will continue to bring that justice and will ultimately bring that justice. And so for us then, I'll leave you with two particular words that come to us from the Apostle Paul. First in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 7, then in Colossians chapter 1 verses 19 and 20. In the first chapter of the epistle to the Ephesians, the Apostle Paul writes in verse 7, "In Christ we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our sins, according to the riches of his grace." Now, I explained at the top that Hebrew phrase that we've been centered on, Goel Chadam. Goel meaning avenger, but also in other contexts meaning redeemer. Because what we find herein is that in Christ we have redemption through his blood. Why is this the case? Well, the Apostle Paul, the very same, says in Colossians chapter 1 verse 19, "For in Christ all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." And how does that be the case? In the very next verse, verse 20, "And through him," through Christ, "to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in the heavens, by making peace through his blood shed upon the cross." I want you to see the incredible connection to what we've examined in these Old Testament passages, particularly Deuteronomy 4 and Numbers 35. All of this, even in the execution of justice in the world, was also a central typology, as we would say, or a foreshadowing, a prefiguring of who Christ is and what he would do. What you find by the time you examine all the expositions concerning the blood of Christ in the New Testament, you find through its connection to the Old Testament that Christ is the blood avenger. He is the blood avenger of God. He is the one who brings justice against evil. He is the one who brings and executes justice against the wicked, against the one who brings death and chaos and hell. Yet also, we consistently refined that Christ is referred to under the same kind of terms that describe these cities of refuge or these sanctuaries. Christ in himself, his body, is referred to as the tabernacle of God, in which, as the apostle is highlighting here in this very passage of Colossians chapter 1, in which the fullness of God was pleased to dwell bodily. His body served at the temple as the human sanctuary in which the glory and the very nature and substance and essence of God dwelt and resided. He is figured as the prototype of the ark, hearkening back all the way to Noah, that in Christ, and by extension in his body, the church, one finds refuge from the wrath of God, from the justice and of his judgment. So he is both the blood avenger, the one who brings justice against evil and wickedness and death and hell, yet also, typologically, we are the ones who are guilty of said evil. We are the ones who are guilty of wickedness in the world, of injustice. And so he also becomes to us, typologically and symbolically, the sanctuary city, in whom we find refuge, in whom we are protected and defended. Not that justice has gone absent, not that righteousness and the consequences of its violation have been swept under the rug, but indeed that both in bringing and providing sanctuary unto his people, unto all those who would submit to him, who would place their trust and their confidence and their hope in him, who would pledge allegiance unto him as the king over all the universe. He also brings justice against the evil that we have committed and cleanses us from that unrighteousness by his blood. I hope you're seeing the typology play out here. That of evil, blood is required because of the destruction of life and of the very image of God that death and chaos and darkness brings upon it. That blood is the only way by which true justice can come against such evil. And Christ is both the one who brings divine vengeance, justice against evil, and is also the one in whom we, as the evil ones, find our sanctuary while being cleansed by that very blood which he did not seek of us, but rather which he spilt for us. The power of this imagery, the power of this typology, the power of this symbolism that points us towards the ultimate truth of who Christ is and what he has done is really difficult, if not almost impossible, to truly grasp and appreciate in the entirety of its cosmic and metaphysical consequences. The absolute existential poetry and beauty of Christ both being the blood avenger, the bringer of justice, as well as the one who provides sanctuary and allows us who have sinned and violated the standards of God's justice to find sanctuary in him, all while he, not bringing our blood to account, but rather shedding his own blood for us. This is what makes him unique as the blood avenger, because the blood that was spilt was not us and not ours, but rather he spilt his own. This is the weight of the unmatched and unparalleled beauty of the person and work of God incarnate. This Christ, the blood avenger, the warrior God, who both destroys, annihilates, conquers and triumphs over evil, while safely securing, saving, rescuing and redeeming all of his people, all those who would come to him, who would turn from that very same evil and who would be renewed in life, who would be granted entrance into his kingdom, and who would be joined to him and to his allegiance forevermore. Christ is the one who makes peace with us through his blood shed upon the cross. Amen.